about Syria's past, present, and future. So I give you Professor Martin's on State Without Citizens, the Tragedy of Modern Syria's Historical Experience.
Thank you. It is a tragedy, so it should be dark. Well, thank you all for coming, very much indeed. And I want to echo Professor Katz and thank Cecily at the Center for the Study of the Middle East for sponsoring this event. Again, the unfortunately absent director, Ambassador Faisal Al-Shibadi, and his assistant director, Professor Chigamba, who is here, and my department as well, for their efforts. So I hope you're enjoying food. Is it good? Well, as Professor Katz said, one of the chapters from the book was circulated, chapter 4, which is called Punishing the Enemies of Arabism, and that is paired, that constitutes half of my treatment of this phenomenon. It's called the al-Malki affair. The other half being chapter 5, which is entitled Making the Martial Citizen. And that sort of goes to the heart of the argument in the book, which is that during this period, Syrian intellectuals, state institutions, etc., attempted to construct an ideal citizen by a variety of different means. And this is, classic sort of post-independence developmental effort on the part of the Syrians. And this effort continued from the beginning of independence up until at least the 1980s, 1990s, which I'll be discussing a little bit at the end. And the main argument I make is that the initial construction of the citizen was a classic civic republican idea of the citizen, one who's defined both by rights, but primarily by responsibilities to the state. And that in the course of Syria's historical experience, that this idea of the citizen disappeared, the idea of a sovereign political being, sort of the subject of politics, disappears and is replaced by an object rather than a subject, one of mass mobilization for ideological parties, particularly the Ba'ath Party. So I'll start by giving you, there's the book, giving you a sense of the periodization scheme that Syrians until quite recently used themselves. This was from the 1960s until at least the late 80s, early 90s. This was the way in which Syrians' historical experience was represented to Syrians. School textbooks, journalism, etc. So you have, of course, the French Mandate period, which is despised as colonialist occupation, then a brief period of civilian government, and these we're talking about the notables, the urban notables, who also had senior government positions in the late Ottoman period and in the French Mandate. These same families, 40 to 50 families, dominated Syrian politics during this time. Then you have a dramatic change in 1949. You have a series of military coups. Most of them were planned and executed by one man, but initially he did this on behalf of senior officers and then took power himself finally, Colonel Adnan Shishaki. And then when he is overthrown by a rebellion within the army, largely because he decided to make himself a Juan Perón style civilian president for life and was thought to be abandoning the armed forces as true base. The whole system was ostensibly dismantled. And so that's why the Syrians refer to this period, 1954 to 1958, as the democratic years. You had, in the Syrian context, unprecedented press freedom, freedom of speech, assembly, etc. And you had elections, imagine that. Actual elections with multiple candidates, and actually the defining election in September 1954 has always been described, rightly I believe, as the first free and fair election in the Arab world, and one of the last, sadly. Then, of course, you go to the United Arab Republic. Once again, the military intervenes in politics in 1958, and that's part of the story I'm telling here in the book, is how we get to that point. And they dissolve Syria. It becomes part of the United Arab Republic with Egypt, and becomes the northern region of the United Arab Republic. The name Syria itself disappears from official documents. And then a conservative counter-coup backlash by the old traditional politicians and conservative elements still within the armed forces, seceding from the United Arab Republic, and therefore sort of demonized as the secessionist regime. And then what is much more familiar to us, you have, again, a series of military coups in 1963 to 1967, in which gradually a smaller and smaller number of ideologically similar military officers take real power in Syria. It begins as an attempt to return to the United Arab Republic, at least rhetorically. But very soon the Ba'athist officers purge the Nasrists from the government and move down their own road toward revolution, as they describe it. So you have an increasingly leftist-oriented, third-worldist, revolutionary regime until, again, another correction. In 1970, you have Hafiz al-Assad, who comes from within this group, but was more conservative than his companions, overthrows his comrades and mounts what he calls the corrective movement, or the correctionist movement is sometimes translated. So what's happening during this period? As I said, you have, during the democratic years, you have this project of civilizing, of making citizens. And it is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in state and private media. This is just one example taken from the magazine Al-Jundi, or the Soldier, which was a popular defense ministry publication, one of many that were created under the previous dictator, Colonel Adib Shishakli, but were used in much the same fashion during the democratic years. So you have this oafish character who doesn't know how to dress, he doesn't know how to behave in public, he curses, uses foul language in restaurants, he gossips loudly at work, he berates and scolds his wife in the street, he eats while walking down the street, which is something actually Syrians think is really vulgar. And another major instrument of this is the magazine Syrian Broadcasting. This is the first issue here, which was published again under Shishakli, the military dictator, and the story connected to the cover photo is entitled "The World Hears Damascus," celebrating the expansion of the Syrian Broadcasting Service and its ability to reach other Arab states, eventually Western Europe, and via shortwave, the Western Hemisphere. In fact, there you will see letters letters to the editor in later editions of this magazine in which there are Syrians, for example, going to graduate school in the United States or attending college in the United States, who write in saying they were able to receive the broadcast, and they mention content and so on. This was the instrument of one of the characters who feature in the book. There are three figures who either are the exponents of or the subjects of this citizen-building discourse. The first is an attorney called Najat Hassan, who was a communist, but allied himself with the military dictator in order to mount his own pedagogical project. That's how I describe this discourse in the book, as an exercise in pedagogy, and this material, like the cartoon strip I just showed you, as being a mirror for citizens, much like the mirror of the prince's literature that featured in medieval Renaissance Europe and later in the Ottoman Empire. So Saab Hassan becomes famous in Syria. He becomes known as the radio attorney because of this program, and transcripts or edited transcripts of the programs appear in the magazine, which is the source of the material of it. This is, he and the next subject I will discuss, very interestingly to me, although frankly, explicitly secular in outlook, structured their columns in which they communicated, or the program and the columns in the case of the doctor, like a fatwa. And in fact, I call them secular fatwa in the book, in that it is the classic form of the specific question and the general answer. This is the magazine The Doctor. This was a private publication, unlike all the others, published by Dr. Sabri al-Qabani, who started in much the same way that Prasad Hassan did. He had a radio program called Your Doctor Behind the Microphone, and then he began to publish columns in the form that I just described, in a variety of different newspapers, magazines, etc. And ultimately, in 1956, he published his own magazine, which was very glossy. It was a very expensive production by the standards of the time, and financed almost exclusively by advertisements for pharmaceutical companies. So today, what we would call big pharma. And this is a class, I believe, taken. It's actually very quickly discusses a very interesting image. There are 3 of these by the same artist that appear on the cover of early issues that are Orientalist in perspective, painted by a Russian artist who emigrated to Italy. And I have not been able to figure out how Qabani became aware of these images, but this depicts a medical class in a Persian academy. And you can see the diagram is actually the way in which at that time vision was understood. Those were the eyes and the brain behind. This magazine, again, was part of this citizen building project. Qabani was interested in hygiene, science, progress, creating what I call the rational citizen, one who is free of superstition, who is happy to purchase pharmaceuticals from international companies to treat diseases, etc. And he also wages a campaign to create what I call the heteronormative conjugal citizen. It's like whenever people write to him for advice, if they're young men, part of his response is almost always, get married. Get married now. And in particular, this is his main bit of advice for people practicing what he calls sexual deviance, which was the normal term at the time, or what we would call homosexuality. And this is for contemporary politics, for the subsequent history of Syria. This is the most important figure, Colonel Adnan al-Malki, who was the deputy chief of staff of the Syrian army during this period. And as I argue in the book, was in terms of public awareness, was a very obscure figure. I could only find 3 or 4 instances in which his image or his name appeared before he became famous in death in 1955. But he was assassinated. He was a big sports fan. He was at a soccer match at Damascus National Stadium. And it was a match between a Syrian and Egyptian team, there with a bunch of dignitaries. One of the military policemen, a non-commissioned officer, who was charged with protecting him and the other dignitaries, according to the story, walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head twice, and then turned the gun on himself. And so you have this controversy then that explodes, that becomes roughly the Syrian equivalent of the Kennedy assassination, in terms of fascination with the detail, disagreement about what actually happened, conspiracy theories, etc., etc. He, after he was killed, almost immediately, within hours, you have a press frenzy begins, again in state media initially, that then moves to private media as well. And there really are almost no exceptions to this, that once the official narrative was created in the state media, it appears that everyone felt they had to go along with this. And so the narrative went like this, that al-Malki was the epitome of courage and decency, cheerfulness. You said they talked about his radiant smile, about his fits of explosive laughter, how he was loved by all who came in touch with him, either professionally or personally, that he was heroic in the extreme, that he, like any martyr, he foresaw his own death, but continued to behave in the same way he had before. So you have this narrative in which, again, elements of religious martyrdom are incorporated into this secular narrative. He, according to the narrative, he was killed by the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, or SSNP, which was the creation of a man named Antoine Sade, who had a very different vision for Syria's future than most other ideological parties did at the time. The Ba'ath, of course, were what we now call pan-Arab nationalists, in which they visualized the proper state for the nation, for the Arab nation, to stretch from Morocco on the Atlantic coast all the way into Iran. Whereas Sade and the SSNP were advocates of Syrian nationalism, and so you have essentially what we Bilad al-Sham, the Levant with Cyprus added in, and a few details elsewhere. It's a very odd sort of, I would say, environmentally determinist sort of narrative that this area I just described was unique in global history, and that uniqueness shaped and formed an equally unique people who came of it, who existed over the eons in this place. The SSNP also looked to Baghdad rather than to Cairo as a possible source of unity, as a natural ally, and they were not explicitly hostile to the role of the United States in the region. So this made them anathema to the Baathists and the Nasrists and the communists, etc. So according to this narrative, which becomes part of judicial proceedings, which I'll describe in just a moment, the SSNP killed al-Malki because he was the only one who could stop them from achieving their objective, which was to infiltrate the armed forces, take it over from within, then take over the Syrian state and dissolve it. Make it part of the Baghdad Pact, ally it with the United States, and then ally it ultimately with Israel. So they were the enemies of Arabism, according to this narrative. And again, one of the chapters is about the way in which these enemies were punished by the state. So immediately, as I said, this press campaign begins, and it essentially has two parts, which are interdependent. The first is the sort of sacralization of al-Malki, turning him into this secular nationalist saint. And the second part is turning those who are alleged to have killed him into unspeakable monsters. And this is accomplished through a variety of different means. In the press, just incessant description of al-Malki's qualities, stories from comrades in the armed forces, particularly those who fought with him in the Arab League's Army of Salvation during the First Arab-Israeli War, 48-49, in which he's described as heroic beyond belief, that he was the rain for which the trees yearn, that his blood sanctified the soil of Palestine, etc., etc. On the other side, you have and this is what chapter 4 discusses, you have an equally broad and energetic press campaign to vilify the SSNP and all of its presumed allies within Syrian society. And you have a criminal investigation, begins within days. Interesting thing, one of the reasons that many people believe in conspiracy theories is that al-Malki was killed at the National Stadium, as I said, and approximately 2 miles down the street was the headquarters of al-Binat, the newspaper of the SSNP. And the people rose up in anger and stormed this office and destroyed the printing press and set fire to the building before al-Malki's death had been officially announced. So this plays into all sorts of conspiracy theories. So he is given a state funeral. This is his brother Riyadh in front here holding his medals. And he's one of the main proponents of both of these different processes I described, the sanctification of his late brother and the demonization of those who were alleged to have killed him. This is part of the, you see other soldiers holding his official photograph in uniform. This is the initial procession that went from his home to the Umayyad Mosque and then from there to his initial resting place. Now he lay in state. Again, this is a relatively obscure figure in terms of public awareness who is given a state funeral as if he's president. And all the sources indicate that the army forced the civilian government to do this. And he lays in state in the Umayyad Mosque, right next to the shrine in which the head of John the Baptist is said to reside, and in between that and the tomb of Salah ad-Din, the hero of the Muslims in the Crusades. So this is pretty heavy stuff in terms of the heroes with whom he is associated. Oh, later, there will be another series of funeral processions in which al-Malki's body is disinterred from his family plot in the public cemetery, and it is moved to another place that has been specially prepared for him. And this is from the cover of one issue of Al-Jundi, again, the Defense Ministry magazine, showing the memorial that was purpose-built for him. This is part of a process, where I would say more, pun intended, more concrete forms of commemoration of al-Malki. During the 20th century, Damascus spread enormously, primarily to the north and to the west, toward Pasiyun, the mountain that overlooks the city. And you see the classic sort of process that has been described as housemanization, in contrast to the old city with its narrow, winding streets, etc. You see big, broad, European-style avenues and boulevards lined with trees, European-style homes, etc. That, the main thoroughfare of this neighborhood is renamed within, I think, 2 months of his death as Adnan al-Malki Boulevard. And then, in 1957, this is constructed at the northern terminus of the boulevard, and the square in front of it, which I'll show you in a moment, is renamed Adnan al-Malki Square. And has, all the attributes you would expect with the eternal flame, the 24-hour military guard, one from each of Syria's services, etc. In 1965, the center of the square is transformed by the commissioning and erecting of the statue of al-Malki, which is really not particularly heroic, I don't think. He's climbing a mountain or walking uphill. His own aliyah, I suppose, would say. And if you look at photographs of the statue up close, you will know why most Syrians say that the model, it's not Malki at all, that the model was Charles Lindbergh. It looks almost exactly like him. So you see, again, representatives of all of the military services in Syria attending this, the opening commemoration of this statue. And then around the same time, the neighborhood to the northeast of this square is named al-Malki, and that becomes the sort of upper scale residence of cabinet ministers, senior army officers, foreign ambassadors, diplomats, etc. That's where, actually in a relatively modest house for the neighborhood, that's where the late President Hafez al-Assad lived for the entire time he was president. And in the end, you get this. That's, again, key to my argument that these processes, again, of sanctifying al-Malki and demonizing his enemies gives, sort of enables and valorizes authoritarian currents that were always present in Syrian politics, and results in the citizen as a concept being transformed from, again, the sovereign subject politics to the mere object of mass mobilization. And this image is, although I don't think she had seen it at the time, is sort of expresses visually exactly what Lisa Wedeen was talking about in her book, Ambiguities of Domination, that is about the Assad personality cult, the way in which it functioned to make people behave as if Assad was something he was not, that to behave as if he was the greatest politician in human history, the most benevolent ruler in human history. Thousands and thousands of attributes. The first pharmacist, for some reason, he was described as. He was the first of everything, according to this narrative. And people were expected, Wedeen argues compelled in some cases, to behave publicly in front of witnesses as if he were all of those things and more, as if he were the stern but benevolent father and they were his children who appreciated him protecting them from all of the enemies that Syria faced. Because that's key to this as well, is the process of turning Syrian history into a sort of monochromatic morality play, one in which there is good and there is evil, just as you see in the al-Malki affair. Now Syria is good and its enemies are evil, of course. And there no subtlety, no complication is permitted in this narrative. And interestingly, this is also reflected in a very famous short story by the Syrian author Zakaria Tamer, that's been translated into English and is often used in Arabic literature classes. It's called Tigers on the 10th Day, and it's an allegorical short story. All of his were, he was the master of this genre, and all of them were structured and presented as if they were children's stories, but with extremely adult, serious themes. And in this one, you have an animal trainer who approaches a cage in which a tiger has just been captured in the jungle and brought to the zoo, and announces that he will demonstrate to his audience how to break a wild animal. And so over the course of 9 days, this sort of carefully calibrated manipulation, abuse, terrorizing, etc., until the tiger becomes something else. On the 10th day, the story says, the cage in which he resides disappears and becomes a city, and the tiger becomes a citizen. That's the word, is the word that Tamer uses. And just before that, on the penultimate lesson that the tiger is subjected to, he is told to behave as if he is a member of other species. For example, in order to get his food, he's told, you must mew like a kitten. Eventually he does this, then he's told, you must bray like a donkey. And eventually he learns to do this. And in the process, again, it's like he loses his true nature, his natural state, and becomes something else, what the state wants him to become. And this theme is in virtually all of Tamer's stories, sort of the totalitarian dream to transform nature. And it's so ubiquitous that his friend, the late poet Muhammad al-Mahut, compared him to Charles Darwin, saying that the former demonstrated how how monkeys had been made into men, and that Tamer shows how men could be made into monkeys. Of course, as we know, Syrians are not monkeys. And we have seen evidence of that, of the incredible courage that they've shown since 2011, staging initially peaceful protests on a mass scale throughout Syria that were ruthlessly crushed, as is, one could argue, in keeping with the nature of the regime. And so my modest hope is that by telling this story and giving people examples of an alternative future, perhaps, from the past, an experiment, however abortive, of democratic governance, in which Syrians were able to, on their own initiative, of their own volition, they were able to create a democratic electoral system, a functioning parliament, and a new constitution that granted, again, extraordinary rights in terms of speech, assembly, belief, and so on. That this model will provide some sort of hope for the future. I'll stop there and answer whatever questions you have. Yes, sir, Professor Shah.
An obvious question. How was the issue of religion and religious identity, or sectarianism, you can call it, although I don't like to call it that way, how was that managed during the democratic transition?
Yeah, the cartoon I showed you earlier is all of the older Syrians who were alive during this period who I spoke to about this. I would show them these cartoons and stories and say, have you seen this before? Do you remember it? How does it resonate? All of them said, well, this guy in the picture, even though he's not identified as such, he's one of the country people. He's from the countryside, coming to the city, and he doesn't know how to behave. And for sort of upper-class Sunnis in Damascus, in particular, that meant member of a religious or ethnic minority. And of course, that conflict, often exaggerated, or often you often get reductionist arguments to say that's all you need to know, which is absurd. But that conflict is key to understanding this outcome, in the sense of Assad, as I'm sure you all who follow in Syria know, that he and his family are Alawis, and that this has been one of the key arguments that Islamist opponents to the regime have made. During the 1976-1982 uprising that produced Hama, which we thought was so horrific at the time, and now it's nothing compared to what's happened in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood referred consistently to Assad's government as the sectarian regime. And so that was key. But in the discourse that I've looked at, it's almost like the absence indicates the presence of these concerns, in the sense that people would allude to sectarian identity, but were very, very reticent to sort of let the genie out of the bottle and open Pandora's box, as it were, because they know how contentious this is. So, for example, in the judicial proceedings against the alleged assassins of al-Malki, most of whom were either Alawis or Christians, the press never says this Alawi, this Christian, but they will refer to the person's home village, even though they've lived in Damascus for 20 years, and everybody who reads that knows it's on the Alawi mountain, for example, or they will provide a complete name of the person and the name of his father, so that you'll see a name like Abdul-Masih, for example. Yeah. So it's there, but it's almost never addressed explicitly.
But it's not repressed either, right? I mean, while listening to you, I was thinking about the Kemalist experimentations of this. And there's a similar urge to create a citizen, but at the same time, the modern citizenship is supposed to repress the religious identity.
Was supposed to be what, sir?
To repress or leave aside the religious identity.
Yeah, al-Malki was a member of a Sunni urban notable family, and most of the people, senior officers in the armed forces who mounted these two campaigns were also Sunnis. And most, as I said, most of those who were arrested, tortured, put on trial, executed in the end, 2 of them were executed, were either Alawis or Christians. But people were very careful not to state that explicitly. Yes, a little.
Hi. In the chapter that you sent around, you discussed what was the false attribution of this assassination to the CIA. My question is, since in 1953 we did have the coup against Mossadegh in Iran, and Allen Dulles was head of the CIA at the time, what were the real activities either of the CIA or the United States, and conversely of the Soviet Union, with respect to Syrian politics in this period?
Yeah, well, start with the Soviets because it's easier. I mean, they were just getting into Syrian politics at this time. Most of the political leaders for the first decade or so of Syrian independence were hostile to the Soviet Union, as hostile, if not more so, than to the United States. And it was only, or it was primarily, because of U.S. foreign policy, which I think I say in the book that the whole idea of neutrality was offensive to American policy. And so they would not accept that. They saw that as merely a cover for alliance with the Soviet Union. So every time the Syrian government would sign some sort of trade agreement with the Soviets, there would be a public event at which ambassadors would speak, embrace one another, declare eternal friendship, et cetera, the United States would sort of ramp up the pressure. And this is happening in the context of trying to create, along with the British, this, again, the CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, a companion to NATO that ultimately folded, which we usually refer to as the Baghdad Pact, because initially it had Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, and Iran in it, and gradually they all fell away. While that's taking place, the United States is also, and this is all documented and acknowledged now, is attempting to overthrow the Syrian government. There's a very famous case in 1957 that the Syrians foiled. They approached, they're named CIA officers under diplomatic cover in Damascus, approached military officers and attempted to bribe them, and they just went and reported it to military intelligence, and then they sort of took over in true Cold War style. They took over the whole operation and set these CIA guys up who were expelled from the country. So of course this is happening, and there were close relations for a brief period between certain CIA officers, particularly Miles Copeland, the father of the drummer in the Police, who was a career CIA agent. He was particularly close for a brief period to Colonel Shekels, the previous military dictator. So those who followed hated the CIA for that association as well. I have not seen any evidence. I looked through all of the available documents in the National Archives, U.S., either Department of Defense, State, etc., on Syria during this period, and I could find no evidence of anything other than outrage at the accusation, but sort of like, it's very defensive language. And there are, during this period, early 1955 to early 1956, there's a surprising number of those little folders that appear inside that say, this document has been removed, it's been reclassified, so who knows? Who knows?
Okay, so first, is al-Malki still venerated in Syria under the Assad regime of Hamas and Bashar?
I don't know about the last 5 to 8 years because I haven't been able to spend much time there. But it seemed like there was a publishing industry that from the 60s through the 80s that I describe in the book as sort of like, I knew him, I was there kind of report. That journalists, army officers, politicians, memoirs in which there would be an entire chapter, or perhaps 2 chapters, about the al-Malki affair. They were central to it. It's a very breathless sort of accounts, including Mustafa Tlass, who was like where is it? Here. The defense minister of Assad. And then it seemed to go quiet for a long time. But then, interestingly enough, in 99 or 2000, a television series, a musalsal, these sort of historical soap operas that the Syrians are so good at producing, was made called Haman al-Kishen. And it was about al-Malki. And of course, he was presented in just the way that I described. I had a copy of that, and I lost it. Very, very.
So basically, the fact that his alleged murderers were Alawites didn't hurt his veneration, though Assad understood about Alawi itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. One thing I just mentioned in passing in the book, and that I probably should have examined in more detail, is that this dichotomy that I set up, of the Ba'ath being pan-Arab and the SSNP being Syrian nationalists, it's very interesting. As part of this process of the small coterie of military officers ultimately taking power, and then Assad himself individually doing so, much of the old leadership of the Ba'ath Party was purged and sent into exile. For example, Michel Aflaq, who was the founder of the party, went to Baghdad and became the guest of Saddam. And many of those figures asserted at the time that these guys, Assad and his friends, were not real pan-Arabists. They were not Baathists. They were actually Syrian nationalists in disguise. And several people have written about this, how Syrian foreign policy under Assad gradually came to resemble more and more a sort of greater Syria objective rather than pan-Arab unity. And the latest indication of this that I've heard is that because of this idea of the nation and the region in Ba'athist ideology, that Syria cannot be a nation, it's a region of the Arab nation, right? So the Ba'ath Party had a parallel structure. One was called the Regional Command, and one was called the National Command. And I heard that recently the National Command was just disbanded in Damascus, ceased to exist. So, as the prophet John Lennon said, the dream is over, I suppose, in this regard.
Yeah, the second thing, like the socialist realist pictures, actually you have already identified the general. But are many other figures also identified, like such as particular notables, or are they symbols of this or that?
Yes, this is a brother, this is a cousin, this is another brother, this is his wife, and this is a civilian guy. I think he was one of the senior figures in this Pedagogical, the regional command I was talking about. And this guy's apparently a North Korean. That's the joke the Syrians say, is that that supposedly this painting was painted by a North Korean artist who had experience with the cult of personality there, the Kims. And the joke is that he just took the same painting, sketched for it, and changed, put Arab heads and and on them, and he missed this one.
It's probably the painter himself.
Could be, yeah, much like the Renaissance tradition, right?
Yeah.
The artist appearing in the work. Yes, sir.
Because history books always take a long time to write, and one of the challenges for historians of the contemporary period is that events change around you and you have to sort of rethink the book. And you had two, I can imagine, I don't know how long it took, but you had two mega changes as you were writing. First of all, Arab Spring, and then the calamitous civil war. So what happened for you in writing this as you wrote towards this shift in landscape?
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I was there, the first year doing research for this was when just after this guy died and Bashar took over. And so they had this phenomenon that was described locally as the Damascus Spring. You had all of these intellectual salons open up, and intellectuals began to publish, just sign petitions, bayans to the government, demanding the dismantling of the state of emergency, the legalization of political parties, competitive political parties, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they were locked up, mostly. And things went quiet until the Arab Spring. So, you know, it didn't. It's an interesting question. I'm not aware that it had any impact on like my understanding of Syrian history or the significance of the events that I'm describing, but it did impact the final product in a much more material way, in the sense that I couldn't go back to do the research I wanted to do. So twice I had to change the thrust of the book and change the subject matter of the second book project. I have not been able to go since 2010, and I don't anticipate that I'll be able to go given the current state of affairs before I retire. So, anybody else?
I can ask a question.
Please.
Because I was reading the chapter, you mentioned the cult of heroism that is grown around al-Malki. Does that find expression also in government-sanctioned literary production, or just independent works of literature?
Yeah, I mean, there's those two categories are not as mutually exclusive in the Syrian case, I think. So, sure, as I was saying earlier, up until the late 80s, early 90s, he was still a key figure for people who were publishing, and it's almost exclusively through state presses, of course. Because this is has been a corporate state for a very long time. It felt like it was sort of a requirement and a mark of authenticity, as a Syrian who knew your history, had experienced it, was politically engaged, to mention all that. And again, it was always in that sense that even under the United Arab Republic, Nasser's Ministry of Culture created a publishing house that was specifically geared to the heroes of Arabism, and so they published a biography of al-Malki as part of that series, and they continued to publish it in Egypt long after the UAR was dissolved. So, you know, in many ways, and I argue that the cult of al-Malki served as a model, as a sort of reservoir in which to take things for the martyrdom of Assad's first son, Bassem, who died in 1994 in an automobile accident, and then for Assad's cult of personality as well.
Was the creating this sort of cult around al-Malki, was that the biggest push towards authoritarianism during the democratic years? And maybe in the citizens' eyes, or was there other big things going on?
Yeah, I mean, that was the single most prominent example. I mean, if you survey the press of the period, that's one of the first things that jumps out at you, is how this guy didn't exist on April 21st, 1955, but starting on like April 23rd, 24th, he's on the cover of every newspaper, every magazine. And that goes on for years. So I would say that he is the most important figure, but of course his story is told in the context of what we were discussing a minute ago. This conflict with the outside world, the hostile forces that are just waiting to dismantle Syria and to steal all of its resources, et cetera, et cetera. The CIA, the Israelis, so the usual suspects.
In what you called the attempt to do the rationalization of the citizen program, I'm not familiar with early Syrian history at all, so I'm curious what time period does this really sort of gain momentum, and you know, from starting to really gaining momentum, kind of being almost assumed to be complete. Is it sort of like the end of the Ottoman period in Syria, or is it actually really beginning with the independence part in the 20s, or when and how, sort of on a graph in a way, like when does it begin and when does it kind of hit its peak and when does it sort of plateau out?
I might have to defer to my Ottomanist colleague for this, but my understanding is that the concept of the citizen was, except for maybe a very, very tiny elite who read French or other European languages, was introduced to Syrians in the Ottoman context. That was during the Tanzimat, the period of great reforms in the mid-19th century, and after that, the various changes that took place, that's when various forms of citizenship and ideal citizenship were communicated to Syrians. And that this has been one of the great arguments in historiography is you look at Syria during the late Mandate and after independence, and everything's like patriotism and Arab nationalism and so on. It's like, how did this happen? You know, what were the models for this? Did they just borrow? Did they just graft on Arab to other forms of citizen and nation, that national identity that they were exposed to?
And was it just the elite, or was it pushed down into the school system, so it was sort of countrywide at that point? And when was that point?
Yeah. As far as I know, the first attempts to really create, to mobilize people on a mass scale, to engage in different corporatist practices, to expand the reach of the state dramatically through education, journalism, etc., takes place under the dictators, from 49 to 53. And then everybody builds on it after that. But the problem is, from my perspective, of trying to track this in any kind of accurate way, is that the democratic years are so interesting just because they are so exceptional, in the sense that you can actually read stuff. You know, yeah, that there's a mass of discourse that you can access, whereas that's not the case before. And again, this may not be fair, but this is like the later political actors always criticize the notables, the guys who had been in charge for so long, for being greedy and selfish and not having a vision of the future, and therefore not having any perceived interest in educating the masses. They were afraid of that sort of thing. We don't want those country people coming to the city. We don't want to build factories. It will just attract these kind of people, and then they'll stage riots and so on and so forth. So there really isn't an attempt to disseminate these ideas until the first civilian government is overthrown. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe I misunderstood you. I hope I did. Like,
You hope you misunderstood me? That's an excellent beginning.
You said you don't see yourself maybe going back to Syria in your career. Do you not see a Syria coming back?
Not anything I would recognize, no. And that is the consensus of my Syrian friends who are in exile as well, that they will not see anything they recognize as Syria, except perhaps Damascus, in their lifetimes. That it's gone. That it may not even cohere as a state. I mean, this is the classic part of the whole. You saw this with, I think you were present when Josh Landis gave his talk about Syria and so on. This is one of the arguments that's put forward, is that what we are seeing now as a result of the Arab Spring, of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and all of the demons that all of this unleashed, is the dismantling of the effacement of post-World War I settlement that created the Middle East as we know it. And that whatever appears to replace it, it will not resemble what was there in the past. And so you have these arguments that, for example, ISIL is going to create a state that consists of enormous chunks of Syria and enormous chunks of Iraq. And then perhaps there'll be a Kurdistan in Iraq, and the rest of it will go to Iran, or, you know, there are various different narratives, sort of trajectories put forward. But, no, I mean, first of all, I cannot foresee a situation in which, A, there would be a Syrian government that is in control of security throughout the country, the way, anything close to the way the previous regime was. And in part because of that, I can't foresee a situation in which any funding agency that has a relationship with the United States government would give me money to go to Syria or anyone else. And frankly, this is what's happening on the ground there now, in my opinion, is in large part a consequence of this. It's the process of turning politics into a zero-sum game. That there will be one winner who will take everything, and the losers can go into exile or into their graves. And in the process of that playing out, what's happened to Aleppo and is happening to Idlib could happen to virtually every place else in Syria. And then even if tomorrow, the peace talks that are going on that work so well at restraining the Russians from bombing Doctors Without Borders hospital, even if tomorrow that's successful and you have true and perfect peace in Syria, how many of those refugees are going to be willing to go back? How many, and what sort of means of sustenance will be waiting for them there?
Nobody back.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think it's almost universal that maybe for the first couple of years there was that hope to go back, but everything's been severed.
I want to thank Kevin and Martin for taking it.